Yesterday, the Biden administration sent another $550 million arms package to Ukraine, including ammunition for high-tech rocket systems. President Biden has authorized over $8 billion in security assistance for Ukraine in the last year, as the country grapples with crippling inflation.
And some are taking heed. Senator Josh Hawley revealed yesterday he would vote against Finland and Sweden's bids to join NATO, adding that the U.S. should point to China as our biggest adversary, not Russia. Host of the Pushback on the Grayzone and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast, Aaron Maté joins us now to discuss. Aaron, welcome.
Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. More funding for Ukraine's war, defense, etc. It seems like there's unlimited appetite among Biden and the Biden administration to supply Ukraine in this way. This is a major foreign policy commitment, I guess, the administration has chosen. My question is why? What do you make of this? What do you think is going through their heads?
Well, as Tupac said, they got money for war but can't feed the poor. And that is the dominant mentality in Washington. There's always endless money to fund the military-industrial complex and to pursue U.S. hegemonic aims. That's what the U.S. agenda is in Ukraine. There's no concern here for Ukraine's sovereignty or territorial integrity. Those are just fancy words to dress up. But this really is a proxy war. And Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, made that plain when he said, we want to use Ukraine essentially to weaken Russia. And I think people inside the White House see an opportunity to continue to weaken Russia by prolonging this war rather than go to the negotiating table, which they refuse to do. Antony Blinken has said that he won't engage with Russia when it comes to the topic of Ukraine. They won't even have talks. And it's just amazing that they can be so nonchalant about this ongoing confrontation when it not only sacrifices Ukrainian lives, not only sacrifices lives around the world because of the rising food prices, but also continues to raise the threat of confrontation between the world's two top nuclear powers.
Aaron, two things. One, is there any particular strategic significance to these particular high-tech rockets that are being purchased now? And also, has there been any pushback from folks on either side of the aisle about this most recent package of aid?
Well, U.S. officials claim that these weapons, these HIMARS, have been effective in destroying Russian positions. I'm not a military guy, so I'm not in a position to evaluate that. I suspect, though, that the dynamic remains what Antony Blinken said back when he was working for Barack Obama. And Blinken said very clearly that no matter how many weapons the U.S. pours into Ukraine, Russia will always have the overwhelming advantage because of Russia's proximity and its military size. It's right there, and it has a huge military. That was when Obama was refusing to undertake the very policies that Biden is carrying out now. And I think what Blinken and Obama said then stands today. But we'll see. Perhaps U.S. officials will be proven correct and this will turn the tide of the war and Russian forces will be chased out. I just highly doubt it. And I'm sorry, your second question was?
About who, if anyone, is pushing back on this?
Oh, there's no pushback at all. No. Just recently there was a vote in the Senate to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. And it was a unanimous voice vote, including Rand Paul, who supposedly has been leading some of the anti-war sentiment in the Senate. That was unanimous. So no, there's no pushback at all, except for a small faction of the Republican Party that occasionally votes no on these things. No, there's nothing because, war is bipartisan. The only question is there are some people who want to devote more resources to confronting China rather than confronting Russia. But otherwise, the underlying policy of using Ukraine to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian is pretty much shared by everybody in both parties.
Aaron, your outlet, The Grayzone, recently published a piece about Zelensky freeing some really dangerous members of the Tornado Battalion as part of Zelensky's plan to release prisoners with combat experience. Can you speak more to that?
Yeah, I didn't write this article, but it's a chilling rundown of something called the Tornado Battalion, which, because the Ukrainian government is increasingly desperate to fight off Russia, many of its forces have been killed. It recently released members of this battalion called Tornado that have been involved in really some sadistic crimes, torture, crimes against children. And these are the kind of forces that have been used by Ukraine, not just in this war, but in the preceding 8-year war in the Donbass that kicked off after the U.S. backed a coup in Ukraine that ousted the elected government. And that set off a war between the new U.S.-backed coup government and rebels in the East who didn't want to live under their rule. And so in that war, and in this war now, Ukraine has turned to fascist battalions, including Tornado and also the Azov Battalion. And that just speaks to the importance of not having this war. Instead of fueling a war that involves fascists, we should be calling for peace. We should be encouraging negotiations. Russia has laid out the basis for a diplomatic settlement from the early stages of this invasion. It will require some concessions on Ukraine's part, but the alternative is fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. And I don't see how that's in anybody's interest except for warmongers in Washington.
There was a great column by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times today, which I've now referenced several times on the show. I'm just so surprised to agree with Thomas Friedman. But he talks about how, according to, I guess, his contacts in the U.S. government, which I'm always curious, why he doesn't tell us more about them, but that there is increasing doubts about Zelensky within the Biden administration. This coming after Zelensky has kind of consolidated one-party rule, has done autocratic things, has consolidated the media, has done all these things that is characteristic of regimes that we purport to oppose. That if you're illiberal, if you're not playing by the norms of Western-style liberal democracy, then we don't want to support you. But of course, we do support those people all the time when we think it's narrowly in our best interests. So I'm curious, how much longer do you think the Biden administration can claim this is some ideological stakes, right, between Western-style liberalism and the kind of right-wing autocracy that Russia is in some sense, I guess. But like you said, it's very confusing when you look at the details of who's on whose side.
Yeah, look, even before Russia invaded, Zelensky had taken some authoritarian steps. He had banned 3 major opposition television stations. And this was done, according to Newsweek, as a welcome gift to the Biden administration. So this was in line with what Biden wanted. So this claim that we defend Ukraine because it's some bastion of liberal democracy, when it's also one of the most corrupt governments in the world, is a joke. And yeah, Thomas Friedman didn't explain what he meant when he said that U.S. officials are apparently growing impatient with Zelensky, so it's open to interpretation. What I take it as is that the U.S. is preparing to throw Zelensky under the bus when he's no longer useful. He's been very useful in being used as a U.S. tool so they can portray him as this hero. He gets these fancy photo spreads in Vogue magazine with his wife. He's, giving appearances at the Grammy Awards, at graduations for colleges to basically do PR and ask for more weapons. But once this runs out, once he's no longer useful, I think the U.S. will do to him what they always do to their assets and basically throw them under the bus. And he'll be rewarded possibly by a well-funded stint in exile. But the rest of his country will suffer. And for the sake of his country, I hope he will embrace the negotiations that the U.S. has deliberately stopped him from doing. That's an important point. In late March, Zelensky said he was ready to negotiate. There were plans for talks in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine. Boris Johnson, then the prime minister, was dispatched from the UK to go to Zelensky and tell him, sorry, no negotiations with Russia. And that was the end of that. That speaks to who's really in charge here.
Well, Aaron, we always appreciate having you on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.